For some people, it may seem somewhat of an odd combination of topics, because when we think of Islamophobia, we think of either speech or action that's directed against Muslims as Muslims by non-Muslims. And when we think of sectarianism, we tend to think of things in places like Iraq or Pakistan. And particularly these days, we tend to think of conflicts between Sunnis and Shia. It's been said it's an underreported phenomena in countries where Muslims are minorities. You know, we tend to think of this as something that happens out there somewhere. But we really want to ask the questions, how are these two phenomena alike? And we also want to ask the question, and this is a question I think that I want to ask all of you to think about, is what can we do to diminish them? We're not going to eliminate them. It would be very naive to think that we are. Let's think about some definitional terms. When we think about sectarianism, it's usually thought of as conflict between religious groups, like Muslims and Christians, or between subgroups of the same religion. Sunnis and Shia is the one that comes to mind most often. But it almost always involves boundaries that you can't cross, socially, conceptually, theologically. It involves stereotypes, and usually it involves hate speech. And there's a difference here between some of this terminology that's used in sectarianism that's global, that you find it almost everywhere. We don't need to go into this in a lot of detail, but you know, you'll find people that will say, for example, the Shia have a different Quran than the Sunni. You find that everywhere that you have Sunni-Shia conflict. And there are other terms that are particular to individual cultures, societies, and nations. I'll just give you one example there. In Indonesia, people say that Shia are communist. Now, the reason for that is that communism is the big enemy other in Indonesia, going back to the mid-1960s. So if you want to say something bad about somebody, you call them a communist. If you don't like Shias, you call them communist. The other thing that is true about sectarianism is that in countries where Islam is a very public phenomenon, where it's a political phenomenon, we find that sectarian disputes are located in public space. And sometimes we find sectarian violence that's located in public space. You know, I can think of all sorts of examples, some from South Asia, I know of some from Indonesia, but it's a very public phenomenon. In societies where Muslims tend to be minorities, and a lot of people honestly don't know the difference between Sunni, Shia, Ahmadiyya, Ismaili, you know, on and on and on, that sectarian differences tend to be more located in private space. Who will pray together? Who will invite who for an Eid celebration? Really big questions about marriage. But those are not public phenomena, they're private phenomena. And in many cases, sectarianism is also linked to local and global political rivalries. The biggest one involved in Muslim sectarianism today that kind of spills over into other places is what's virtually a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And they both mount very large-scale public diplomacy campaigns that either talk about how bad the other one is, or they talk about how good they are. But they're both very active in this. Islamophobia is if we look at this, if I look at this as a linguist or as an anthropologist, I will say it's very similar. It uses the same kind of language. It involves boundaries that can't be crossed. It involves stereotypes. It involves hate speech. There are also global and culturally significant symbol sets. For some reason in the United States, there's this kind of weird idea floating around in very Islamophobic circles that Allah is a moon god. I have no idea where this came from, but if you Google Allah the moon god, you're going to come up with a very large number of hits, and almost all of them are based in the US. And the other thing, it's also political, Islamophobia. It's linked to geopolitical rivalries. In the US, they kind of don't know what to do right now because they really hate the Iranians and they want to say bad things about them, but they decided that the Saudis were their friends. So they have a little bit of a problem with their rhetoric there. But Islamophobia outside of government circles is directly linked to Jewish, secular, and Christian Zionism. Some of you probably don't know what Christian Zionism is. Again, this is a U.S. phenomenon, a U.S. fundamentalist Christian phenomenon. They think that until the Jews return and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, which means knocking down the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that Jesus can't come back. So they're going to be Zionists and they're going to support the most extreme Israelis so that they can help Jesus come back. Now, if this sounds absurd, I don't shoot the messenger. Again, if you Google this, you will have no problem finding it. And in both cases here, one of the things they do, and this is what does and what can lead to violence, is that communities come to define each other as existential threats. In other words, the existence of your community is a threat to mine. And there get to be stories and rumors that go around like, oh, these people are out to destroy Islam, or oh, these people are out to destroy Christianity, and they have vast conspiracy theories. The other thing about Islamophobia is that it's also usually often connected with racism and anti-immigrant sentiments. And when I'm mentioning anti-immigrant sentiments, that would apply certainly in the UK, in the US, in Australia, anywhere where you have significant, not even immigrant populations, but people who are the children and grandchildren and by now great-grandchildren of immigrants still get boxed into that category by people who do Islamophobic thinking. So, in a way, what we have here is we have two very closely related phenomena, but they exist in different geopolitical and national political contexts. But they use the same kinds of symbols and the same kinds of rhetoric. Now, we don't need to really go into the details of that rhetoric very much because everybody's pretty much familiar with it. But I want to go through briefly, and these I think are things to ponder. These are things that, I didn't think these things up. We didn't think these things up. These are things that we've encountered in different places, everywhere from here, Nigeria, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Niger, lots of different places that seem to have been effective at countering both Islamophobic and sectarian rhetoric. It's not going to make it go away, but it can be effective in diminishing it. One of these is, and this is primarily on, but this is for both, focusing on Islam as a religion of love for God and all of His creation. Specifically, this counters kind of Islamophobic claims that Islam is a religion of violence. Rejecting the stereotypes that other people use. In other words, when you hear somebody say, oh, the Sunnis are like blah, 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 you just turn around and say, come on, give me a break. No, they're not. Or The same would if they say it about the Shia. And in this, that means focusing on common symbols and narratives, but we can't ignore the differences. We have to acknowledge that there are differences within Islam. Although it's pretty easy to fall back on certain quotations from the Quran that will say differences with from Hadith, which will say that differences are a blessing. They're not something to be struggled against. They're something to be celebrated. Other things, and some of these are not exactly religious. Philanthropy, public service, working against poverty, disaster relief, economic development. These are things that can be done by people of any faith, and cooperative efforts here, they simply demonstrate, in very practical terms, shared humanity. Co-sponsoring public events. Very simple. Well, sometimes it's not so simple because it can be hard to arrange. But co-sponsoring public events, and again, they can be religious events, they can be charitable events, they can be football games. I know one place in Indonesia where you have a Muslim school, kind of like a madrasa, and you have a Christian school. And one of the things they do to promote interfaith relationship is they play football, right? And on the football pitch, it doesn't make any difference, right? I mean, they're playing football. You don't care whether the people on the other sides are Christians. I had one guy in London a few years ago say, you know what, we don't care who you are. You can be a Christian, you can be a Jew, you can be a Muslim. We don't care at all as long as you can play. So things that actually bring people together in shared activities. And again, working together to combat social problems. All sorts of social problems. Drug abuse, poverty, human trafficking. The list goes on and on. These are things that people can agree about. And when you find things to agree about, things to work together on, it sends a message out there. It's like, okay, we're different, but we're all humans and we all have a lot of the same values. And just in a general sense, speaking and acting in a positive way. Setting an example for other people. And especially setting an example for young people. Because young people, always and everywhere, are the ones that are most susceptible to falling into these traps of closed communities and sort of looking with suspicion and hatred at other people, which I think is where I can leave off on this, and I hope that later on that that we can share further some experiences and ideas about what we can all do to counter both sectarianism and Islamophobia.
Thank you, Prof. Woodward. The second speaker is Fiyaz Mughal. He has been instrumental in setting up and building the national interfaith organization Faith Matters. He also founded the National Hate Crime Project, TellMAMA, which was the director of this nationally recognized faith hate crime reporting project from 2011 to 2016. He set up the reporting procedures and the classifications of incidents, lobbied central government, police, and crime commissioners, MP and EU stakeholders, and successfully implemented a national reporting process. In 2009, he was honored with the OBE with his work with communities. He is regularly featured on TV and in print media. Without further ado, Fiyaz.
Thank you very much. Let me start off by giving you a contextual background of what has happened in the last 5-6 years around Islamophobia, and I'm going to use the terms Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred interchangeably to some degree, but you'll hear me using more anti-Muslim hatred, and let me explain what that means when I'm talking about that. There is some distinction in our work between those who may question faith and religion, which people have a right to do, but actually there is, when people are targeting other people because of who they are, when they are breaking elements of their property, when they are daubing graffiti, when they are spitting at them, when they are saying things which involve harassment and public order offences, then all of that sits in the work we do. However, there are points where people who don't like Islam also attack Muslims. Those cases we also look at. So in a way, let me just make a slight distinction around using the term Islamophobia in the sense that if people don't like religion, they're not really an issue. That's just a kind of a debate for society to have. But let me start off by saying since 2012, since we started work, we have seen a significant rise in two things within Muslim communities as a whole, and I'll come on to the sectarian issue. The fact is that, one, clearly we knew in 2012 that fear within Muslim communities was going to rise. We knew it because we were hearing levels of fear affecting the mobility of Muslim women in their daily lives. Okay, we could see that, we could hear it from victims, we could feel that Muslim women were curtailing their activities, some of them were slowly changing appearance, and that was happening in 2012. So the levels of fear over the last 5 years have risen significantly in Muslim communities. Why do I also say that, apart from the cases we've seen and how and what victims say to us? Well, I happen to sit on a body in the Home Office which looks at applications from faith institutions for things like CCTV and security measures. It's open to all faith communities, but there's an increasingly larger and larger set of applications from mosques which are asking for extreme measures of securitization, gated communities, large number of CCTV, high visibility fencing, very reminiscent of what's happened around synagogues. That's what's happening. We can see that in terms of the fear levels within Muslim communities. So there's a sense of heightened fear. The other thing we saw over the last 5 years has clearly been a year-on-year rise in the number of cases we have reported and seen. Partly that's due to people knowing we're around and knowing they can report in hate incidences, but the real fact is that's also because of more incidences against Muslims taking place. That's a fact. We see that. What are the drivers of anti-Muslim hatred? There are a number of them. Political shifts and changes in the balance of where Europe and other countries have reached, including things like Brexit, have certainly created a sense of fissure in communities and breakages in links between communities that were there for many years. Inflammatory press headlines clearly make a difference. They change the perspective, and to some degree some of those headlines dehumanize individuals. You only need to think about the headlines of The Sun about 2 years ago saying 1 in 5 Muslims support jihadis and support IS to know that that has quite a significant dehumanizing impact in the way other communities will see members of Muslim communities. Terrorism and the impacts of terrorism are, in terms of data, one of the most, if not one of the most, they are the most significant driver of fissures and fractures and large spikes in anti-Muslim hatred. Every time there's a terrorist incident, there's a significant rise in anti-Muslim hate incidences happening. Now, there are a number of causal factors, such as press, such as changing political environments, such as far-right networks, but also the fact is, sadly, terrorism and violence is frankly, a major driver in rising up the number of incidences that are taking place. So there's a really change, there's a real shift in the political and social environment of what we've seen over the last 5 years. And it's been a very difficult one for Muslim communities across the board. Most of the individuals that have been impacted upon have been Muslim women, we know that. We know the mobility of Muslim women, the ability to go out after work, security, feeling safe and secure whilst wearing the hijab, all of that has been affected. And we are in a different place than where we were 5 years ago. We know that online, the volume of anti-Muslim hate, and I was just talking with colleagues from City Circle, the volume is significant. The negative sentiment towards Muslims and Islam is significant and voluminous in nature. The other factor is social media, we know, has changed the whole debate. Social media has really given an opportunity for some of the voices that really shouldn't have a platform. It's given them the opportunity to spread some of these highly inflammatory, malicious, and sometimes very targeted campaigns towards not just Muslims, but also, we have to be honest, towards Jews and other communities. So social media has been a driving factor. But I think, added to all of this environment, we have seen one other thing that happened which really has led to an element of sectarianism creeping into the UK environment. The fact that Syria and post-Iraq, the collapse of what took place in Iraq and the breakup of Syria has been the major driver for sectarian hatred and sectarian hate cases that we have seen. So clearly what happened 2,500, 3,000 miles away actually created quite a little bit of impact here, but it wasn't small. There was an impact in the United Kingdom. So let me tell you what the impact was. We started TellMAMA in 2012. 1 year later, just imagine this, you start a project, it's got to cover the whole of the country, you've got limited resources, many people will not know what you do, they won't be able to report in, but even after all of that, 1 year later after starting, we received 28 cases of anti-Shia hate that were reported to us. We think that's quite significant, given it's just a year into what was then a very southeast-based project. So 28 cases of anti-Shia hatred were reported in 2013. Allied to that, I remember activity that was taking place by Anjem Choudhury and his crew up and down Edgware Road. I know that because I was here when he assaulted, or not, he didn't assault, his followers or his supporters assaulted two individuals who they thought were Shia just on Edgware Road. That was 2013. That was basically because they were inflaming tensions by using the Syrian crisis and anti-Assad sentiment to whip up sectarian hate. So there was actually assaults on two individuals on Edgware Road in 2013. So it was really close to home. This stuff was not just one or two cases maybe in Birmingham or Manchester. It was happening up and down Edgware Road because these people were here, 20, 30 young people around Anjem Choudhury using the Syria crisis. Just one localised example, but on a national basis, in 2013 there were 28 cases of anti-Shia hatred reported to us. In 2014 there were 23 cases of anti-Shia hatred reported to us. So really kind of a stable number, but they were there in the background, they were being reported in. Clearly the driver was Syria, clearly the sectarianism between the politics around Iran, Saudi Arabia and Egypt was spilling over in terms of satellite feedback and what was being picked up here through satellite channels. We know that because in some of the cases, the anti-Shia rhetoric that was put out on Facebook and targeted at individuals was citing and linking to some video content that was being beamed in from overseas. So the international sectarian issues, again, were spilling here because of satellite TV and rhetoric and people's inflamed feelings around what was taking place in Syria. In Bradford, I remember this case because it was quite concerning. In Bradford, the Shia mosque in Bradford reported in a very large graffiti that had been placed on it. I remember this in 2013-14. With the terms Shia Kafir emblazoned all across the front of the building. and it was the first time that individuals in Bradford from the Shia community actually had felt intimidated. So you can see the real impact. Then let me go on to 2015. This is an issue that hasn't gone away, and it's an issue that just bubbles away within Muslim communities. And it's a tough issue, and it's an issue that I don't like dwelling heavily upon, given that there are a range of issues happening, but I think we all need to have the courage to say it. I think, I've repeatedly said it. In 2015, we received 29 cases of anti-Ahmadiyya hate. And there were quite vicious cases of anti-Ahmadiyya hate. Boards outside mosques saying, no Ahmadiyya is allowed to pray, openly visible. Breaking of windows, use of the term kafir emblazoned across Ahmadiyya mosques. And here it gets even more concerning, is the use of Facebook to target and to use a case that was one of the worst I've seen in the UK around sectarian hatred. The murder of Assad Shah. Anyone know that case? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so just today, me and my colleagues were putting together a set of videos on a Barelvi group in Pakistan, which has for the last 2 years been using the killer of Assad Shah as being a symbol of Islam and a lion of Islam. Okay? They pour this stuff out every single week. Just some language here that my colleague showed me yesterday, and I had to you just have to step back and listen to it. So this is a Barelvi group who's got over 100,000 Facebook followers. There's an individual I won't name on camera, but this individual is quite charismatic. And he can fill a mosque with 4,000 or 5,000 people quite easily. And just to give you a summary of the talk that he gave, about a year ago he gave a talk saying and describing exactly how Assad Shah was murdered because the kafir deserved it, effectively, in his eyes. So this preacher says and describes the way that Assad Shah was murdered because the killer of Assad Shah was actually transferring information from a Glasgow prison to this group in Pakistan. Don't know how, don't know where, but this information was getting through to this group in Pakistan, and this preacher, this cleric, was effectively lionizing the killer, but cleverly doing it in a way, not only to reach out to his followers in Pakistan. He knows full well that Facebook and the mechanisms of Facebook and the connections with the Pakistani diaspora community, which are large here, will filter that stuff back in here, and that the murderer of Assad Shah was a Ghazi and a lion warrior of Islam, and was the new, quote, form of Saladin that is needed to kill blasphemers against the Prophet Mohammed. And he goes on to describe the 27 stab wounds that Assad Shah had. We didn't know, but clearly the killer told him, and the fact that Assad Shah's head was caved in. Okay? So we got a problem here. And the problem is something I never seen in my generation. I'm 46 years old. There's a sense of creeping violence that's coming in. And there's a sense of actual foreboding, and it just is bubbling under the surface. Is it a major fissure right now in the United Kingdom? The answer is no. Has it cost lives? The answer is yes. Has it the potential to cost lives? The answer is yes. Has it the potential to radicalize individuals who, watching Facebook elements like that and thinking that killing anyone who is of another sect is legitimate? The answer is yes. The language used by preachers is so enticing, and I use that not positively, is so enticing to minds. The connection with Islamic terminology is so clever, and the play on emotion within subcontinent cultures is so cleverly done that some individual may well be taken in by this. And in fact, the killer of Assad Shah consistently refers to this group as the one that gives him a sense of strength. So has the anti-Ahmadiyya situation changed? The answer is no. At this moment in time, there's not a single Muslim group that has stood up and said, we've got a problem with potential violence against groups like the Shia community. They have actually, to be honest, the MCB said that, I have to be fair. They said that 2 years ago. And hats off to them for doing that. But there's been nothing said about the anti-Ahmadiyya rhetoric. Nothing said. In terms of this kind of activity, our view is nobody has to agree about who is right towards the path of God. Nobody has to agree. If you think I'm wrong, fine, we can debate it. If you think Ahmadiyyas are wrong, debate it. If you think Sunnis are wrong, debate it. It's the nature of life, it's called debate, it's called dissent. What we're talking about is the targeting of individuals in the real world because of who they are. And in the work we do, and I do, if somebody regards themselves as Muslim, then we classify them as being Muslim in our stats and in our support. We don't say you're Ahmadiyya, frankly, you're not Muslim. The fact is, if you classify yourself, we record it, we support it. And so the reality is, when we're talking about Islamophobia, the quiet, dirty little secret, which groups who work on Islamophobia never mention, is the sectarian Islamophobia that just bubbles away underneath. And to be fair, has cost a man his life in a shop in Glasgow, where he was so brutally murdered, the poor man could hardly even be recognised. Okay? So, I don't want to paint such a brutal picture, but the reality is we have an issue that needs addressing. I think the Muslim communities have the confidence to address it. It's not that they don't. But we need the leadership to stand up and say, this is not acceptable. It is damaging to Muslim communities. It is damaging to our set of who we are as a set of Muslim communities. And it's damaging to our place in society because, frankly, let's just set aside the hate crime world. Okay? There's the whole hate crime arena, the whole hate incident arena. Any form of sectarianism coming in, as I've just described, from Pakistan. And by the way, when we talked to Facebook about the group, they said, we just don't know this group exists. We don't know. Can you translate it for us? So this is what we're dealing with. The fact is, we, I think, in the UK don't want young minds influenced by such poison and such hatred, which is clearly coming across from these areas. So there's two things I want to say. Let's have that discussion. There's two things I want to say. There is an issue of intra-Muslim sectarianism. We've documented it. We know the stats, we know the figures. It's not a case of saying, you're Ahmadiyya, I'm Sunni, we're not going to see eye to eye. No. This is about broken windows, daub graffiti, leaflets and pamphlets saying you're not allowed to come in here. This is about damage to property and people. And I think that that's indicating to us that some work needs to be done internally on these issues.
Thank you, Fiyaz. Sorry, I'm actually a bit overwhelmed, with some of these data because, it reminds me of a panel that I facilitated while I was in Nigeria, where, unlike in Southeast Asia, where I was from, the attacks, the anti-Shia attacks or anti-Ahmadiyya happens in the virtual world, and in places like Nigeria, and now even what Fiyaz said, it becomes manifested into, actual violence of killing somebody. And I think as a human being, I think we owe it, to humanity to do something about it. So I'd like to open it to the floor. Perhaps if someone would like to say a comment or if you have any questions. Yes, sir.
Thanks for a very interesting talk and sharing a lot of very useful data with us. Now, the actual topic, which is sectarianism in Muslim communities and Islamophobia, two sides of the same coin, I don't think was really discussed, you know, and you know, if you could shed some light on that, because I think probably when we talk about hate crime, then whereas in a general sense hate crime is wrong, then you can find that the origins or the motivation for that hate crime, or the different hate crimes, can come from two very different places. So I want you to perhaps discuss a little bit about that. The second thing is, you talked about debate in passing and saying you can debate these things, but the fact of the matter is that these debates are not actually taking place. So when you talk about sectarianism within the Muslim community, whether it's Shia, Sunni, Ahmadiyya, etc., etc., there's some underlying issues, you know, that are being used to, you know, in the case of the murder, perpetuate these crimes. And unless these issues are discussed, then those quote-unquote stereotypes will continue to perpetuate. And the final point is, the issue of unity has not been discussed. So when you talk about sectarianism within the Muslim communities, then how do you look at unity within the Muslim communities? So for instance, is there a debate to be had there? And also, when dealing with the wider society, should you be outing one group, you know, or disparaging them just because you don't agree with them? Is, I'm sure, you know, one of the panels, the panel will know what I'm referring to. So those three things.
Let me answer. Yeah, let me come on. I'll try to be as quick as possible. I mean, you're absolutely right, sir, that there is no sense of dialogue around the sectarian issue right now. There was a little bit of work done on a press release that was put out showing imams from Shia and Sunni communities coming together after that individual was attacked on Edgware Road. And that was the only bit of work that was done. But that was a bit of a PR thing, saying here's a press release, a couple of photos of the imams, which was a good thing to do because it helps to reduce tensions. Beyond that, there's been nothing. Okay, beyond that, there is very little. If I'm being honest, the Shia community actually reaches out more consistently and tries to say, because they as a minority are deeply aware that they need to be reaching out as a small minority community. I find them much more, you know, outwardly reaching to try to create dialogue and engagement points. Is it happening? It's very slow, but it's not resilient enough. If there was a major crisis in the Middle East, if there was another major fault line, it's not resilient enough to deal with it, and you'd find fractures in this country quite quickly. Okay, so that's problematic. My challenge is that resilience to be able to deal with a major another crisis, because it'll happen in the Middle East. The fact is it needs to be built and quickly. Let me just say two things. The issue of unity is a very good point. There doesn't seem to be any sense of discussion or even projects or even thinking around what binds Muslim communities in their value systems, Shia, Sunni, Ahmadiyya. Just even something as basic as that. Yes, we're Muslims, you know. Yes, we have clearly commonalities, but what are those binding points is not discussed as a way to start a sense of empathy. It's not there. So there's a lot of work on that score. And the last thing you said about Islamophobia and two sides of the same coin, I didn't quite get. Could you just give me a little bit more of a description? I do apologize.
I'm just saying that perhaps, you know, hate crimes in general, you know, whereas they're wrong, that they probably originate in very different places.
Yes, they do. I mean, yes, they do. I mean, hate crimes do not happen in isolation, sir. They just don't happen in isolation. The nature of anti-Muslim hate crimes is opportunistic. Let me explain this. The nature of what we see on a daily basis is that one individual walking down a street will have the opportunity to see a visible Muslim woman, and say something. So it's opportunistic in nature, but let's be very clear. The perpetrator will already have been conditioned. The perpetrator will already have been conditioned somehow through text, information, or through media sources that they've been absorbing. So we also have to be honest that the whole issue of, the dehumanizing element between the communities is still there. And I think that is still creating the environment in the eyes of some people who think, oh, you're Shia, you're not really a Muslim, you're not really equal to me. There is that element that's there, and it still festers in some quarters.
Next question. Yes.
What do you think about sectarianism along different kind of classifications of sects, as opposed to the classical ones of Shia, Sunni, Ahmadi and stuff? For example, things to do with gender, political levels of being like a liberal or a conservative, race, for example, things like that, yeah.
Are you directing the question to Fiyaz, or can I pass it to Woodward?
Yeah.
Okay, Prof, you'd like to take this question?
Well, one thing that's very important here is that I don't like to use the term race because it's not a scientifically valid concept. It's used a great deal, but it is not a scientifically valid concept. It is, however, a sociological concept, so perhaps we can use it in that way. When you find that religious differences and ethnic or racial differences correspond, you have a magnifier or an accelerator effect. That because you have a potential for tension, hate crimes, and violence based on ethnicity, you also have a potential simply on ethnicity. And we can find plenty of cases where there is ethnic violence between Muslims of different groups. We saw that really clearly in some very tragic cases in Nigeria. But when these two differences come together, you tend to get an escalation there, to the point where it's sometimes difficult to figure out which is which. And certainly, the more of these differences get added in together, the more complicated it gets. And again, another group that's often singled out, I don't know whether it's true in the UK, but it's true in many other places, is calling people liberal. That this becomes a sectarian marker. And some people use the term for self-identification and other people don't. But calling people liberal can be just about as damaging as calling them Ahmadiyya. And again, at least in our part of the world, we sometimes see false accusations about this. We'll say, oh, I don't like this person, so I'll call him a Shia, even when he's not. So, and a gender in particularly issues of sexual preference, LGBT issues, can get very, very deeply involved in this. Right? And again, these are people who are advocates for LGBTs, people who are feminist. They often get lumped together as liberals, which again is not even true. I happen to know some very, very conservative feminists. They're very outspoken on women's issues, but in other respects, they're extremely conservative. So one of the dangers here is not just what people are, but how they are labeled. And the labeling process is really a dangerous one.
Yeah, let me just add to that. I think I would completely agree with what's been said. But let me just, if I can just add 2 or 3 things. I think there's a sense today from the loudest voices online. Let's just take this issue, okay? Within Muslim communities, the loudest voices online. I won't name websites, but let's just say that for who they are. The fact is, there seems to be a sense of fear that Islam may be changed over time. And there seems to be this sense of moral defenders of Islam, that Islam is just one way, and that actually anybody who talks about free will, the will to leave Islam or join Islam, any Muslim who says that and says, I'm okay with that, you can leave, you can join, those individuals are then quite maligned by this section of individuals online. So there's this sense that is growing of fracture deep inside Muslim communities in this country. I can see it, it's happening quite across the board, and I've never seen anything like this and I've been working 20 years in the sector. But there's a sense of not just outing, quote, liberals, but anyone who questions the sense of their belief that Islam is static and set, they go after. They put out websites, they put out malicious blogs. Now this tells us that there is a section of the Muslim communities which is not confident or secure within themselves about what Islam and what Islam in Britain means. They're not confident about themselves. So the way to do it is to malign. The way to do it is to say these people are a threat to Islam. So you're absolutely right. There is even more super fragmentation going on within Muslim communities. So now you have a group who are saying, you call us liberals, now we're going to go after you. There's a group that says, these liberals, these people who question Islam, those people who are willing to take elements of Islam and say, let's review it, let's rethink it. They're a threat and we need to out them. Then you have the other element. I've just finished a film. I was saying earlier to colleagues here that we do some films at the moment. I just did a film on black Muslims. And I can tell you that every black Muslim I talk to has said that when they've entered a mosque or an Islamic institution, they've never really gone back afterwards because, frankly, they've not felt welcome. All right? And that's on film. I didn't have to say anything. I said, what's your experience? Oh, I went in and I said, one lady I spoke to, she said, I went into the mosque, I said, Assalamu alaikum, the man didn't answer me. A man came in, he said, Assalamu alaikum, the man answered the male who came in. Just simple things like that. So for her, she just never went back. Another guy, another black Muslim I had, it's going to come out, the film's there, he says, look, I went into the mosque, I came out, I was just standing outside having a cigarette, and they said I should never come back again. I said, what, I'm just having a cigarette? They said, no, we don't want you to come back. And he felt that it was because he was a black guy. So true or not, who knows the facts? The fact is that there is a section of black British Muslims who do not feel connected to what they regard as mainly Muslims from the subcontinent. There's a big fracture there. So, look, there are some real issues. These are some of them. But what the gentleman has said there is really important. There's no sense of exploring the unity which binds. What is happening within Muslim communities is you're in that bracket, or you're in that bracket, and never the two shall ever meet. That's what's happening right now.
Yes, if I can add one more thing, right? When you talk about defenders of Islam, I think that's a very important point, because in Indonesia, there is this group called the Islamic Defenders Front, or IDF, if you were to Google them. Basically, they were just going on protest on the streets to the point that the governor of Indonesia, who is a Chinese, called Ahok, he is currently in jail because of blasphemous charges. And it is a case that is a little bit skewed, you know, he's kind of caught in a catch-22 situation because he said something during a speech which he was provoked, and then in the end, you know, he basically had to be jailed. So, you know, the extent of this, you know, and why do they have to defend Islam? I think no one group should have that autonomy, you know. Okay, next question, please. Yes, Thomas.
On the topic of sectarianism and Islamophobia, I'm curious about how the historic perspectives that certain groups can push can influence these sort of matters. Particularly more radical sort of extremist groups, where they'll present an image, usually conflict-orientated with history in a very clash of civilizations way, and will generally boil it down to, these people were your heroic ancestors, they were fighting this group this is the modern form of this group that you should be fighting. And what I'm curious is, how do we sort of recognise history in the good and the bad, the peaceful and warful times, while not being imprisoned by it along certain narratives?
That is an extremely difficult question. And I'm not going to pretend to have a definitive answer to that, but there's a lot to think about there. And this is, in fact, true. That there are this is part of what goes on in this discourse within Muslim communities. They'll talk about crusaders, or they'll talk about the most horrible thing that ever happened in the history of Islam was the abolition of the caliphate, in meaning reference to the Ottoman caliphate. So they use a historical narrative as a weapon. It's generally speaking not a particularly accurate historical narrative, or it's a historical narrative that's reshaped towards a very specific end. Now, obviously, people who do Islamophobia in Western context do the same thing. They come up with these narratives, and one of their favorite ones, not much truth to it, but that doesn't matter. About how, Islam was a religion that was spread by the sword, and that the prophet was a warrior, so therefore he wasn't a properly religious man, and so you can't trust Muslims because they don't distinguish between religion and war, or blah 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 blah, right? None of these narratives, whether they're the Islamophobic narratives, whether they're the narratives about Christians, and whether or not, there's some pretty nasty Sunni narratives about Shia, and there's some pretty nasty Shia narratives about Sunnis. Everybody shapes these for their own purpose. It is exceptionally difficult to counter them. Because what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Give them a history lesson? Right? I don't think they're really interested in taking, like an upper division seminar on the history of Islam, right? Or the history of Muslim society. It's not going to happen. I think the only way that is potentially effective to counter those things is, one, ignore them. And two, to present a counter-narrative. And this gets back to what you were saying, about how do we do that? How do we come up with a narrative, an effective narrative of unity, of what binds Muslims together, so that we can all say, oh well, these people over there, they're a little bit different, but that's not important. We have these common values, and we can live together, and we can work together. But this is one of those cases where it's really easy to diagnose the problem, but actually coming up with a cure,
it's impossible. It's really difficult.
It's really difficult. I hope it's not impossible.
No, you're right. Yeah, just so here's a narrative. I'm just going to do a bit of a history lesson, but it just fits into your narrative. So, because the professor mentioned Crusades, I'm going to bring up this narrative and the way it's glossed over within Muslim communities and Muslim history. But it feeds exactly into your point. Who wants to wash aside certain facts, just washes them aside to suit their own perspective. We know that. Just one example. The whole issue of the caliphate, that people feel very proud when you mention Saladin. They say they're very proud of it. Saladin retook Jerusalem. He got rid of the Crusaders. Well, actually, the biggest potential threat at one point to Saladin were fellow Muslims who nearly assassinated him. They came very close to assassinating him. It's just not mentioned. So history and religion are not black and white. They are very uneasy bedfellows. Sometimes they may not make sense. Sometimes they leave a lot of doubt. But the reality in today's world is that people don't want doubt. They can't seem to deal with doubt. And I find the younger generation which wants to know, is it this, is it that? Well, actually, it's not so easy. Belief and faith are not black and white. They are grey, doubtful areas. And so, how do you sell that message, sir? I don't know. But we'll be here for another 100 years thinking about it. But I think we need catchy, simple, emotional strategies, the way that other groups use.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sir, 1 second.
Yeah, hi. I think the source of all these problems come from one source, which is because we are talking about facts, what happening, but we didn't talk about solution. I think the source of all these problems coming from lack of Islam. Islam says there is no compulsory in Islam. You know, you cannot force anybody. Plus, we come back to the life of Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. There's an example. The Jewish men used to throw, men or women, I don't remember, they used to throw rubbish at his door. And he didn't say anything. And he used to do it all the time. And one day he didn't find any rubbish. Well, he did. He went to this man and found out what's wrong with him. And actually he was ill. And he said, I came to see you. So you see what I mean? These people, they, let's say, they discovered Islam like yesterday, and today he will say, I'm a scholar. And then he got him killed. So he goes straight to extreme without knowing anything, just showing himself that he's doing something right. That means the source of all these problems is lack of Islam, basically.
Okay.
If we try to teach people Islam properly, then I think this is the best way for everybody.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I take a question now?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Really interesting presentations. I feel like I have quite a few questions, but let me choose one. I was wondering if you feel that there's any difference between generational attitudes among Muslim communities in the UK when it comes to issues of sectarianism. You know, would a first generation Pakistani Muslim, for example, be likely to have stronger, weaker, different sectarian affiliations to their children or grandchildren? Can you see that the problem is evolving, improving, worsening in any way?
So here's another difficulty. When the first group of people from Pakistan, Bangladesh came over in the 50s and 60s, during that period of time, there was no real sense of sectarianism because of a range of reasons. If you're new in the country, if people look like you and they say they're of the same religion, you bind together. It's just human nature. So I guess there was a sense of solidarity and clumping together in a new country which was distinctly and radically different to what, religiously, culturally, visibly. First, I would also say second generation really did not have those big fissures. Okay, you couldn't feel, there wasn't a sense that there was a fissure there. They were settling down, they were trying to make a life, they were trying to get on with the practicalities of life. The fissures really have kicked in after there are two things here. One is the Iranian Revolution. Okay, one is the Iranian Revolution, fissure one. And the second fissure is the Salman Rushdie affair. All right? People don't get it. The second fissure is the Salman Rushdie affair, and they opened up a disconnect between the two communities. Okay? The first was the Iranian Revolution, which did two things. It re-energized, it's really bizarre. So this revolution that happened within a Shia majority country energized to some degree Islamist thinking. It energized it. But it shouldn't have energized it, because the two things are quite polar. But it energized it here in London. What then happened is, okay, there's this sense of Muslim identity bubbling away because of this Iranian Revolution, this sense of actually people were being drawn to this sense of Islam being more of their identity. The Salman Rushdie affair did two things. It created the Muslim identity even more because newspapers suddenly realized there were Muslims in our midst. Before there were Asians. Before you were Asian. Well, now those Muslims, they're going around burning books. They're going around demonstrating. Oh, they're a bit barbaric. That's what was happening. That was the press narrative was there. So Muslims said, okay, we'll take our Muslim identity. But during that period of 1989, when the Rushdie book was published, and 1991, 92, 93, there was a battle, a political battle for hearts and minds in Britain between Iran and the Saudi-Egypt world. Okay? That fissure started to happen. Why? Because people saw, these international states saw an opening that was happening because of Muslim identity forming around what was a traumatic incident for them. This book, which effectively, in their eyes, was insulting the very essence of the messenger. So the two things nobody gets is the battle between, let's call it the battle, whatever you want to call it, but the fissure were two things, the revolution and the Salman Rushdie affair. Now, Syria has just added layer upon layer on top of that, which was quite latent for a while. So we're in here, we're in an environment where it's like an onion peel is starting to develop, and I think that's really worrying, because you can tear one onion peel apart and say Syria's over, but you've got more to take untangled. They're just underneath each other.
Yes, Ben.
Hi. I had an email a couple of days ago from somebody who'd seen tonight's talk publicised and who couldn't actually come here tonight. But she asked me to sort of make a point on her behalf and ask a question on her behalf. Her name's Kaisra, and 12 months ago, her brother-in-law who's a British national, father-in-law, was murdered, was shot in Pakistan while he was visiting, along with his two brothers and three of their friends. They were at some sort of Shia gathering. And what she was asking was sort of a two-part question. I think the first point you possibly covered about how prevalent are these kind of fissures in the UK. But secondly, what can really be done to tackle this? I mean, she's from a family who's been bereaved directly by sectarianism, okay, in another country, but sort of at arm's length from the family. What can be done to tackle the kind of problems that you've described and that you see on the rise here in the UK?
I'll just say two quick things, and obviously, Professor, I'd love to hear what he has to say. The fact there's just two things. What is missing is a lack of leadership right now. It's just as simple as that. There is no leadership that's saying, look, we have a problem, we need to get a resolution, we need to have ideas, we need to have activity. There is a blatant lack of leadership on this. I don't know what the reason is. It's not going to choose one or other side, Shia or Sunni. If somebody stands up and says, let's look at this and address this issue, it will start to affect people if they said, let's deal with the Ahmadiyya issue as well, because so widespread is the knowledge or the belief that Ahmadiyyas shouldn't have or shouldn't be seen as Muslims. So widespread is that belief that the dehumanizing impact is quite significant. Right? So the lack of leadership is really telling. And my call, if people are watching on your film, is as long as there are no voices asking, as long as there are no voices providing that leadership, this is just going to carry on as it is. So that's the missing factor. The last thing to say is the issue of unity is even more important, because it is only a matter of time before another crisis happens in the Middle East. It is a matter of time. And I go back to the issue of resilience. The two communities do not have enough binding points together. If something major happens, if there's an attack on Iran and Iran retaliates against a Saudi nation, against Saudi Arabia or Egypt, less Saudi Arabia, more likely North Africa, Egypt, if they retaliate, there will be a proxy battle going on here. You can bet your bottom dollar there'll be a proxy battle going on here. So the reality is there are things on the horizon. how we build resilient communities together is really important. And this is not pie in the sky stuff. If I said, oh, if Iran is attacked 2 years ago, you would have said I'm nuts. With Donald Trump in power, it's not nuts anymore.
I mean, yes, it is. The Obama has already, cleared the sanction, and Trump said, no, we're going to put the sanction again. So that could be the impetus for, things to happen.
Yeah.
Do you want to add something to that?
Again, this is a really difficult issue, and I want to address this from a somewhat different perspective. And that would be sociology or anthropology.